They were a World War I American unit that never retreated and never lost any ground. They suffered almost 60% casualty rates, serving only 191 days in combat. Their first taste of combat was at the hand of American troops, leading them not to be able to fight under the American flag, so they had to fight under the French. They were awarded 171 Medals of Honor from France, but they were not awarded a Medal of Honor from America for decades to come. They called themselves the Rattlers, but they earned the name Hellfighters, not from their allies, but from their enemies, the Germans. I want to talk to you today about the 369th New York Infantry, otherwise known as the Harlem Hellfighters. My name's Ian Crisp. If you are new to my channel, I am a AC, grip, PA, and editor for reality TV, documentaries, some feature films, and news. I'm usually behind the camera, and this is my first time really making something where I'm in front of it. So I have my laptop out in front of me, kind of acting like a prompter, so forgive me if my eyes dart down every now and then. This channel is usually for my personal videos, such as my demo reels or any short films that I create on my own time. So this video is very different than my usual content. But I am a bit of a history buff, and many friends and co-workers have said that I should start trying to make some videos like this covering historical stories that I find fascinating. Only problem is most of the stories I know come from other channels that have already cemented themselves as historians on the internet, such as Laserpig, Animarchy, Potential History, History of Everything, and Wendigoon. I've actually kind of based my setup here around Wendigoon's videos of just kind of talking to the camera. But I have tried to spruce up the background. I have some prop rifles from my different costumes that I make, Winchester 73 lever action and a Sharps carbine. And I also have a Luger and a gas mask over here underneath the TV. And on the TV is the documentary Men of Bronze, which we will be talking about playing, just giving some nice B-roll in the background. That being said, since I learned a lot of the stories from these channels, I have to find a story to cover that I found on my own that is also important and impactful. And I think I found just the right one for my first video. I will say that most of this video is going to be me looking at you guys. There will be occasional pictures popping up. If I mention someone's name, I'll try and find a picture. Whenever I show the uniforms, that will pop up as well. But for the most part, it's just going to be me looking at you. So this will be a great video to have on when you're driving and you need something to listen to, or if you need something in the background for doing any tasks. One more thing before we get started. I am not a historian. I am simply just a history nerd who found historians talking about a really cool subject and something that's really important, and I want more people to know about it, so here I am. I will have my sources tagged in the description down below. So back in college, I was taking some writing classes, and at about the same time, about 2016, a little game came out from a tiny franchise. If you are a video game fan or a history nerd, you know about Battlefield 1. It is one of the quintessential first-person shooter multiplayer games of the past decade. With the game taking place in World War I, it was able to tell a plethora of stories that not many people had come across, and the game seized the opportunity to kick off the campaign with you playing as the 369th Harlem Hellfighters. And I started digging into it more, and I came across a story that is frankly unbelievable and incredible. I immediately wanted to try and share it with people, and since I was taking a writing class at the time, I decided to try and turn it into a script for a TV series. And now that some of my friends and coworkers have asked me again to try and make some videos on history topics, I thought I would break out the old research and try and make a video about them as my first go. Only to sadly realize that I made a monumental rookie mistake in my initial research and seem to have either misplaced or lost the list of sources I used. I did remember that one of my main sources was the documentary Men of Bronze, again, the one playing behind me. But I had to go out and try and find new sources, more sources, and do even more research to try and do justice to these men. And in doing so, I came across something very confusing and very surprising, and that's the literal confusion around this unit. History Collector Forum discusses it in his videos, that it's incredibly difficult to find information about these men, or at least it was for a long time. One of the key issues is the main officer in charge of these men, Colonel Hayward, was recorded down as Colonel Haywood, which meant that it was almost impossible to find any reference to him. And I experienced some of this as well going back in, where there will be multiple different accounts of a similar incident that don't really... They kind of click together, but at the same point in time, they don't exactly match. Because of this, I wanted to let you know before we dived in that I'm going to address any points of confusion I found. I'm going to address each version that I've heard. And I'm also going to address the versions from my original research that I cannot find the sources for. And I will state then again that the source could not be found for this. So, without further ado, let us set the stage. 1913, New York makes it legal for African Americans to enlist in the National Guard. The only issue is there is no segregated unit for them to enlist into, and there won't be for another 3 years. They make it legal and they do nothing with it. Moving into next year, 1914, World War I kicks off when Serbia assassinates Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. How does this start a world war? Well, it just so happens that Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were allies with different colonial powers that had colonies all over the world. You now have Britain, France, Russia, Germany, Austro-Hungary, even Japan was in the mix, and it's an all-out brawl. The colonies are supposed to stay out of it, but they don't. That's why it's known as a world war, when back then it was known as the Great War. And as you've noticed, America is left out of that. America will be left out of that for a minute because America was isolationist, but it didn't stop us from maybe sending some guns and sending some bullets. On to 1915, and this is something I'm bringing up just to try and set the tone of America at this time period. One of the largest films up until that point hits the silver screen, and it is Birth of a Nation. Now, if you are unfamiliar with this old movie, it has the KKK ride into D.C. to save the country. The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, hosted a screening of it at the White House and called it basically the peak of cinema. This led to the second iteration, or second, I guess, the first rebirth of the KKK. The KKK will come around about 3 times into a stance of major power. First time is in Reconstruction. The second time is right here around 1915. The third is in the Civil Rights era. As you can see, it's not looking good for the cultural atmosphere of our country at this point in time. 1916 rolls around, and the unit is formed in New York under the name of the 15th New York Infantry. Now, I've heard it both ways. The first is that Colonel Hayward, a white Nebraska lawyer who was also a veteran of the Spanish-American War, was also a colonel in the National Guard, and was the Public Service Commissioner of New York City at the time, while having a bunch of different governmental roles in New York before this year here. I mean, he was climbing up that social ladder, maybe 1 year at a position before moving on to the next. He moves. I've heard that he approaches Charles Whitman to try and make the regiment, but I've also heard that Governor Charles Whitman approached Hayward because he knew he'd be the right man for the job. My original research had it that this was a form of counterculture to Hayward. He had served in the Spanish-American War, where an African-American unit of cavalrymen became universally popular among the American people. And he wanted to try and rekindle this, but that was my original research, and I couldn't find it in my new present research. Again, I'm going to point that out whenever I can. As the Public Service Commissioner of New York City, he was extremely personable, and he knew the people, and he knew exactly where to start recruiting. Hayward started playing the political game by getting different pillars of the community and different governmental figures on his side and getting their support. The biggest one of these would be James Reese Europe. James Reese Europe was a very famous composer of ragtime music, and he received his orders right off the bat. He was to make the best damn band that he could, so he tried to bring as many people from his band and the civilian life as possible, while also pulling celebrities and musicians from all over. He also reached out into the Puerto Rican community to try and get musicians from there. This is something that's not really addressed that much, but there were Puerto Rican soldiers that fought in the Harlem Hellfighters. It's known as a black unit, but it is a mixed unit of African Americans and Puerto Ricans. Noble Sissel was one of the famous musicians to join. He was a singer, and he would also become the band's drum major. Another famous celebrity to join in was the actor Burt Williams, who was a friend of Europe and a captain in the California National Guard. He worked hand in hand with Europe in the early days with recruiting. So the 15th is formed, and there really isn't a barracks for the unit, so they take over the Lafayette Dance Hall, and they make it their home. They weren't given any rifles to train with, so instead they had to find sticks and brooms, and they would be outside in formation marching. The veterans describe it in their interviews, like the one behind me with Melville Miller, that it was a sight to behold, and it was a very weird and surreal experience. Finally, they get the chance to get some combat training, but they have to travel down to South Carolina, more specifically Spartanburg, Camp Wadsworth. A little aside is that on one of my first major productions as a PA, the TV show We're Here second season, we are filming actually in Spartanburg, and we're doing a drag show at the very end of the 2 weeks we're there. And where we have people parking their cars to go to the drag show is at a YMCA. And while I'm over there helping people and getting ready to shuttle them back and forth, I find a historical landmarker. And it just so happens the YMCA was built on top of Camp Wadsworth. And it was just kind of a weird full circle moment. And it took me by surprise a bit. I had to double check just to make sure. But I thought it was a fun aside to share. Once the men arrive in Spartanburg, they have a bit of free time. And Europe and Sissel decide they want to try and go into town and get something to eat or get something to drink. I assume they believe that the uniform, rightfully so, should give them some modicum of respect from the townspeople. This strikes me as particularly weird because James Reese Europe was from the South, so he would be more than acquainted with how African Americans were treated at the height of Jim Crow. But they try to go to the store, and the store owner does not allow them in, saying it's a whites-only establishment. Right about this time, some troops from the 27th Division approach the store as well, and they're from New York. They know that the 15th is from New York, and so they try to have James and Sissel's back, and things start to get heated. So Europe just stops the whole thing, says we're not going to have any violence here, and him and Sissel leave. But the 27th make a demand that Europe and Sissel should be able to enter the establishment, or else no military personnel will be going to the establishment. And the store owner, to my understanding, still denied them. And while this was happening, similar treatment was happening all over the base to the 15th, to the point where Colonel Hayward approaches the base commander demanding an explanation for why his troops are being treated so poorly. And he's reminded that the government official in charge of Spartanburg personally sent him a letter letting him know, essentially, to not bring Northern African Americans down to the South. If he did, there would be trouble. Europe, understanding the situation, and anticipating violence on the horizon, gets all the men back onto the trucks and gets them headed back up to New York. But the trouble doesn't end there, and the trouble will not end for a good while. Back in New York, the men are separated into 3 camps. Now, there's one white officer I have not brought up yet, Major Hamilton Fish, and he gets put in charge of one of the camps that the men are separated in, Camp Mills, precisely. Now, at the same time as they arrive at Camp Mills in New York, an Alabama regiment also stationed in New York learns about the minority troops nearby and decides to attack. They decide to attack that night, precisely. Somehow the 15th becomes aware of the Alabama troops' intentions. The only issue is they are unable to defend themselves. It was my original understanding that they had no weapons at all, but more recent research says that they simply didn't have any ammo. As nightfall gets closer, Fish is on the phone constantly calling every single military installation around them, trying to get any means of self-defense. Some troops from the 42nd New York Regiment come by with rifles and ammo and start handing them out, saying they'll come back with more if they can find more. The men are setting up barricades outside using tables and bunk beds, and they're given the order to fire if they are fired upon. Later that night, the Alabama troops do arrive. They cling to the forest around the camp, and they somehow realize that the 15th is armed. It made more sense to me initially whenever I believe they did not have any rifles to begin with. So simply seeing them have rifles would have deterred the Alabama troops. Either way, the Alabama troops realized this is a fight they did not want to have, and they backed off, and the situation was resolved without violence. It's around this time that the U.S. decides to get into the war. We intercept a telegram from Germany to Mexico, the Zimmerman telegram, asking them to attack America, and Mexico respectfully says no. Also, a civilian cruise liner is hit and sunk by a German U-boat, and the cruise liner was carrying American civilians. A combination of these 2 incidents get America fired up, the isolationism goes away, and we announce to the world that the Yanks are coming. With the declaration of war and their training complete, the 15th head on down to the docks to load up on ships to be sent over to Europe. On their way to the docks, they are intercepted by a crowd of mothers who are pulling their underage children out of the line, basically saying that they aren't able to serve. The paper was signed illegally, they lied about their age, so on and so forth. Melville Miller, the man I pointed out earlier, makes the note that his mother didn't come to pull him out, even though he signed up at the age of 16. It's a little funny aside in the documentary. Actually, that's Melville Miller right there. There he is. And the ship they are boarding is a German merchant ship converted into a troop transport ship, known as the Pocahontas. They will become acquainted with this ship very well. As they load up onto the boat and they're headed out of the harbor, they run into a little bit of an issue when the engine breaks down and the ship has to be towed back. In fact, they are stuck through Thanksgiving waiting on the ship to be repaired for them to go, or for them to try again. I don't know why they had to use the same ship. I don't know. So, second time, they load up, they're headed out, and the engine catches fire. So they have to turn around and come back. They wait a little bit, ship gets repaired, they try a third time just for a British oil tanker to come all the way across the harbor and hit right into them and cause a collision, which causes some damage to the ship. Colonel Hayward is talking to the captain of the ship, who was already not happy with the arrangement since they would be going across the ocean alone on that third trip because no other ships were going to France at that time. And so they would be perfect perfect prey for the German submarines. So he's trying to convince the captain. He's like, how bad's the damage? Do we really have to go back to port a third time? We need to get to France. The war's going to start without us, or America's part in the war is going to start without them. And they assess the damage. They realize it's not that bad, but it needs to be fixed before they can cross the open ocean. And Hayward basically kind of goes like, do you have the parts here? And it's like, yeah, we have enough steel and we have enough stuff to fix it up, but we have no one skilled with welding to actually do the work. So Hayward just goes out to his men and asks flat out, does anyone have any of the skills we need to repair this boat? A good number of them raise their hand. They now have a repair crew, and they fix the ship on its way to Europe, crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Hayward makes a note when they land at Brest that they landed right side up. December 26, 1917, the 15th lands at Brest in France. The men offload and they move onto boxcars and they are sent by train to Saint Nazaire. And Saint Nazaire is one of the biggest points of confusion between the documentaries and my original research that I came across in this. So I'm going to start with the documentaries, and then we will go on to the original research. On day one of arriving in Saint Nazaire, as according to Men of Bronze, the one playing behind me, the 15th is kind of resting near where a group of Marines are resting. And at a certain point in the day, a gunshot is heard, and they find one of the 15th dead. They know it's the Marine, so they retaliate, and they kill a Marine, and a Marine kills one of them, and they kill a Marine, and it goes back and forth, back and forth. Some officers get a handle of the situation, and the Marines cry out that the 15th are bloodthirsty and just to send them to the front if they want to fight that bad. But they are not sent to the front. Instead, they are transferred to a labor unit, and they work as stevedores at the harbor for at least a month after this. Moving on to a documentary on Robert Morecock's YouTube channel, the men arrive at a military base in Saint Nazaire, and within 2 hours of arriving at this base, which was segregated, a big fight breaks out. And it doesn't state if anyone was killed or injured in this fight, but it was bad enough that the literal next day they were assigned to be stevedores. The first account makes it sound almost as if it could happen over the span of a few days. The second account makes it sound like, well, it actively states there was only one incident and it was a rapid transition to get them away from firearms. But my original research was a bit more detailed and a bit more extreme. The original research I had that I cannot find the source for now had the men arriving in Saint Nazaire, Hayward in Europe, who at this point in my research, the original research, Hayward was already a lieutenant. So Hayward and Europe go to meet the top brass at the train station for orders, while the 15th waits next to a group of Marines. Now, two members, one member of the 15th, one member of the Marines, have a conversation. Gunfire erupts, both of them drop, and 45 Marines answer the gunfire with gunfire themselves firing into the 15th. Again, this account was incredibly detailed, and it drives me insane. Because the officers hear the gunfire, they rush out. The 15th and the Marines have taken cover behind crates and carts. Europe and Fish, bringing Major Fish back in. Europe runs to the 15th, and Fish runs to the Marines and gets in the middle of them and tries to calm them down. That's when you get the line that they're bloodthirsty from the Marines, referring to the 15th. And again, right after this, they are transferred to a stevedore unit, and they work as a labor force for about a month. And the thing that drives me insane is there is absolutely no evidence of any of these events outside of the documentaries. There is none. Only the interviews. You can type in December 27th, 1917, Nazaré, and you will find nothing. You will find maybe the troops that were stationed in that area at the time, but you will find no incidents. Yet an incident happened that day that was so drastic, they were put onto labor unit duty. They were taken out of a combat role. Hayward's realizing that his men have traded in their rifles for shovels, and he is not having any of it. He goes to talk to the top brass, General Blackjack Pershing, and he essentially says, I brought a fighting regiment. I did not bring stevedores. During this meeting, a soldier enters the room with a message from the French, who are once again requesting soldiers from the American army to supplement their losses. General Pershing has said in the past no American will ever fight under a French flag, but Hayward, seeing no other way to get his guys to the front, says send us. And so they agree on it, and the 15th are sent to reinforce the French as a fighting unit. In stark contrast to how the American army has been treating these men, for the most part, the French are a complete 180. They are welcomed with open arms. They are welcomed with cheers. They are hugged. They are saying welcome, welcome in French. And the men are folded into the French Fourth Army. Becoming a part of the Fourth Army also means that they have to give up a lot of their American equipment, but they get to keep their uniform. So they get French equipment such as French ammo pouches, French canteens, French gas masks, and they also get the French Adrian helmet, leading to one of the most unique looks of World War I, and probably one of my favorites. I am a sucker for military uniforms and gear, and they just look so cool. I'll put up a picture of an American Doughboy, and so you can see the difference. Along with their equipment changes, they also get a change in weaponry. The American Army at this point in time are using two rifles, the Springfield 1903 and the 1917 Enfield. Both of them use 5-round stripper clips to reload. They can reload individual bullets, but this is the quickest and most efficient way to do so, and a lot of the major armies in the war are doing so similarly. This is not any of the rifles that we are talking about, but is the only one on hand. This is a lever-action 1873 non-firing replica. So it cannot accept any of the ammo, and it could not fire it even if it could. So the way you would reload a 1903 Springfield or a 1917 Enfield is you would have the opening into the magazine, you would put the stripper clip resting on top of it, and you would push down into the gun, stripping the clip of the ammo into the internal magazine, and then all that would be left is the metal clip, which you would just flick to the side. Both the rifles are bolt actions, so you would be operating the bolt like so instead of the lever on this one. The French had a very different system where they had the Berthier, which used a in-block clip system in which all the bullets stay on the clip and the clip itself is inserted into the gun. And then when the last bullet is fired, the clip falls out the bottom and you put a new one in and go. These came in 3 and 5 round clips. This is also stripper clip. This is where you get the term clip from. The other rifle they used, a much older rifle, would be the 1886 Lebel, which loaded individually through the ejection port into a similar tube magazine, as you can see on the 73. That's why I chose 73 for this demonstration, because of the tube magazine. The 1903 Springfield and the 1917 Enfield also used a completely different cartridge than the French rifles. The American rifles used 30-06, where the French rifles use 8x50 R millimeter. And the different calibers, the different loading systems is going to cause a problem we're going to see in a minute. And also for any of you who are familiar with the military logistical system, you can see the nightmare that probably is about to unfold. Yeah. I don't want to be the quartermaster. I'd also like to point out that by the end of the war, Colonel Hayward had gotten the Brodie helmet for his men, which is the better helmet, comparing the Brodie to the Adrian that they currently have. But still, I like the look of the Adrian helmet more. This is a personal preference. It's not anything else. I love the aesthetics of it. Once the men are settled in and they've met their new comrades, there's kind of like a reception for the French officers, and James Europe's band performs for them. They start off with regular military marches, but they shift gears on the Frenchmen and start playing something they had never heard before, which was ragtime. And the Frenchmen loved it. And by all accounts, this is one of the first times that the precursor to jazz would be introduced into European culture. And this will continue to happen throughout the entire time this group is in France. They will be playing for anyone that comes by. Hayward will make sure of it, and we'll get to that. It's from the French that they learned that their unit has been redesignated the 369th New York Infantry, and it will stay that designation throughout the entirety of the war. They also have a new emblem, which is kind of like the Don't Tread on Me serpent, but it's on a blue shield. It's actually on the thumbnail for the video. They start to train with the Frenchmen, and there is a newfound sense of pride in everything that the unit is doing. If a soldier is falling behind, the rest of the unit will pull them along and help them get better. Phrases like straighten that damn rifle, fix that uniform are said by Frederick H. Williams in his interview, showing that these men really felt like they had something to prove now. They move with the French army to the Argonne Forest, and if you're a history nerd, you are very familiar with this forest. But surprisingly, at this point, it's actually really quiet. There's kind of a sense of an unspoken agreement between the French and the Germans at this point in time, and things are very calm. They're calm to the point where the Frenchmen are able to hunt out of their trenches, kill boars, and bring them back, and then have barbecue. Each member of the 369th is assigned to a Frenchman, and this is to give them a chance to become acquainted with the trenches. And it leads to some pretty funny moments because the 369th are very antsy. This is their first time in a combat zone, and they're shooting at anything that moves. And you get some very funny responses from the French. The French will stop them and be like, no, don't wake the Germans. Please don't wake the Germans. Oh, that's the Frenchman. Oh, they interviewed a Frenchman when they went to France, and he had a lovely thing to say about the men. That's so cute. He's where I learned about them teaming up with the French. Like, he's the one who had the idea to put them one Frenchman to one two. Backing up the video. Melville Miller does say in his interview that he believes that this kind of panicked shooting led to an increase in hostilities in the Argonne Forest, which could be true, but also the Germans will be ramping up for an attack later on, so it makes sense for hostilities to kick up anyway. Checking back in with Europe's band, like I said, there was a bit of confusion on my part about when exactly Europe gets promoted. One source says that he gets promoted around this time when he gets to the front, and sadly, because of this, he is forced to leave his band, having Noble Sissel take up as leader of the band. That being said, James Reese Europe becomes the first African-American officer to lead men into combat in World War I. With Noble Sissel in charge of the band, Hayward is having them perform for anyone that comes to visit the camp, and this is kind of a glimpse into Hayward's mind, is he's putting them front and center in the public eye as much as humanly possible. This is made even more apparent when the Southern reporter Irvin S. Cobb visits the camp. Now, Cobb is known to talk down to and to mock African Americans in his writings, and so the band was not too psyched about having to play for him, but Hayward pushed them on anyway. So they performed, and they blew Cobb away, to the point where he would be singing their praises in multiple articles he would write after the fact. Later in the war, Europe would become injured by a gas attack while trying to lead 2 machine gun crews. When Noble Sissel learns that he's in the hospital, Noble gathers the band and they all go to say hi and to visit him. And he reveals to them that while he was in the hospital, he was working on a new song called On Patrol in No Man's Land. And this song is insanely... it's a very surreal piece. Essentially, it is just what you do on a patrol in no man's land, structured with a nice kind of swinging tempo, while the music mimics what battle would be like. Instead of artillery, there's drums, so on and so forth. And I always thought that it would be such an iconic, it would be such a powerful image to have while he's like he has the music going in his head while he's writing it, juxtaposed with troops actually out in no man's land experiencing what he's talking about. For example, kind of the swinging, singing rhythm of it would be, "There's a men in warfare coming, look out! Hear that roar, there's one more." I feel like that would be such a powerful image. And it's been in my head since the moment I thought about turning this into a script.
Don't gas for to find you all right. Don't start the bombing with those hand grenades and machine gun, holy spade. Alert, gas, put on your mask, adjust it correctly and hurry up fast. Drop, there's a rocket for the Bosch barrage. Down, hug the ground close you can, don't stand. Creep and crawl, follow me, that's all. The boys, go do it! Hey, get the bloody boys, get 'em, stick 'em, get the bayonets on, ram it on. What do you hear? Nothing near, don't fear, all clear. That's the life of a soul when you take a patrol. Out in no man's land, ain't it grand? Out in no man's land.
A couple of the songs James Reese Europe will write will be about his time in World War I, and it's really interesting to listen to both this song and All of No Man's Land Is Ours. It kind of gets you in the mind of James Reese Europe a bit. Rewinding the clock back to when Cobb visited, he visited on May 14th. May 15th, the next day, would be one of the biggest historical dates for this regiment. On the night of May 15th, Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts would take their positions in a listening post at the edge of French lines in a position where they can listen out over no man's land. If you're unfamiliar with World War I tactics such as listening posts, that's exactly what it is. You are listening for any enemy movement in no man's land, because if you lift your head up, you're going to get it blown off. So you have to just simply rely on your ears. The night goes on, and they are manning their post when they hear clicking and whispering from no man's land. But before they can raise the alarm, a grenade is lobbed into their trench and detonates, putting them both on the back foot. Neither of them are killed by this, but by the time they're able to get up and grab their rifles, sorry, too late, German troops are invading their trench. Between 12 to 24 German soldiers attack Needham Roberts and Henry Johnson. And one thing I am realizing now, looking back on this, is that these are most likely German Imperial stormtroopers. I cannot find any clarification on this, the most I can find is that it was a raiding party, which is what the stormtroopers were. But this is an incredibly big deal. These are not Star Wars stormtroopers. These are the Kaiser's elite shock troops. These guys have the best training, the best equipment, and their tactics rely on shock and awe. Grenades by the dozen, followed by a quick insertion, knives only, slitting the throats of whoever's left. Their entire role is to be fast and cause chaos behind enemy lines. It's the Germans' answer to trench warfare, where the French and the British and the Americans went to tanks. These shock troops would be the future of warfare. Not only is their tactics what the Germans used in World War II for the Blitzkrieg, but it is also what we use today in most, if not all, modern militaries across the world. I'm going to take a quick aside, just because I do love to share, and I'm going to play a segment of the Sabaton song called Stormtroopers about these men, just because I think they sell it pretty well. Be warned, it is a heavy rock band, and I'll put a timestamp here for you to skip to if that's not your thing.
There's no time to mourn. A glimpse of the future, a blitzkrieg is born. Strike at 0 hour with overwhelming firepower. They're fueled by the fear in their enemy's eyes. It's a shock troop infiltration, a fast violent escalation. Out of the trenches, the stormtroopers rise.
Now, Sabaton is a band that makes music pretty much solely about historical events. If that has piqued your interest, I highly recommend you go check them out. But time to get back with the video. There's some more confusion around this point about what exactly happens that leads to the events. One way I've heard it is that, like I was explaining before, between the different ammo types, one country's ammo ended up in another country's gun, and both Needham Roberts and Henry Johnson have both their rifles jam and fail. So both of their guns are out of the fight. But other versions I've heard now doing research is that they used all their ammo and had to resort to other means. Needham Roberts is hit and he is immobilized. He is down for the count. So Henry Johnson is the only one left standing. No one else is coming to help. He knows that if he falls back to get help, they're going to take Needham Roberts prisoner, or they're going to kill him. So Johnson stands his ground. I've heard that he used his rifle as a club, and I've heard that he just used his bolo knife. But he ends up killing 4 of the German stormtroopers and pushing the rest of them back out into no man's land, where he continues to engage them. He ends up injuring between 10 to 20, causing them to do a full retreat. Though he doesn't walk away unscathed, he ends up receiving 21 gunshot and stab wounds. Needham Roberts and Henry Johnson are not found until the next morning, but they both survived through the entire night. And they both survived the war. Henry Johnson will go on to be known as the Black Death for his actions that night, and both Needham Roberts and Henry Johnson will be awarded the French Croix de Guerre. I took German and I took Spanish. I did not take French. I am sorry. Translation is the Cross of Gallantry. Noble Sissel even goes on to write that the first heroes in the American Army in World War I came from this unit, which I think is pretty cool. But it's not only Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts that are getting some action with the Germans now, because things in the Argonne are starting to spice up a bit. By late May, the regiment is under constant fire from the Germans. The Entente forces, what would be known as like the Allies, America, France, Britain, they know that a German attack is imminent. They think it's at the end of May, but in reality it's around middle of July. More precisely, the German offensive starts on Bastille Day. The German Champagne-Marin operation begins, and the 4th Army, along with the 369th, are planted firmly in their way, and they do not yield. By the 4th day, the German offensive is broken, and the Germans retreat. The 369th fought side by side with French troops, Senegalese troops, and the 2nd Moroccan Division. Minna Bronze goes into more detail about fighting with them and their experiences, and it's pretty interesting. Everything before this point has followed about the same outline as the original script I wrote, just with new information plugged in where it needs to be. So it's had a bit of flow to it that comes with a narrative story, but moving forward is purely new information, and so it's not going to flow as much, and it's going to be more bullet pointy if it hasn't already felt like that up until this point. So, and also I really can't figure out how to transition to this point. So we're just going to dive right in. Jim Crow on the front lines. So American troops were not really thrilled with the idea of minority troops being given the same freedoms and liberties as white men in America and getting used to that freedom and being respected. So they tried to enforce Jim Crow, and they tried to get the other members of the Entente to enforce it along with them. They would hand out pamphlets, and it was a whole mess. The French and the British couldn't understand why the men of the 369th would even want to go home if they were going to be treated this way while they were serving their country. And it got so bad that the German troops actually used it in propaganda against the 369th and other African American troops by basically trying to convince them to fight against the Americans. And it's a whole mess. Moving on to the next point, we'll talk about their final battle. They had multiple engagements on the front, but we'll just move ahead to their final one, which might be their most impressive. September 26, 1918, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The regiment played a key role in the offensive by taking the village of Sechant. In fact, they kicked so much ass, they ended up taking 9 miles of enemy territory. To put this in perspective, we are talking about a war that was measured in yards, in meters, in feet. We're talking about trench lines that have been set in stone for almost 4 years with very little alterations and very little ground taken. The fact that they were able to punch through such stiff resistance is incredible. And they only stopped because the French on either side of them couldn't keep up. They were at risk of being overwhelmed and encircled. It's just mind-boggling. After this engagement, 170 members of the unit would be given the same Cross of Gallantry, and the entire unit was given a citation. Just to do a brief recap on their service in World War I. They participated in the Champagne-Marin, which we talked about, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, which we just talked about, the Champagne 1918 Offensive, and the Alsace 1918 campaign. They also took part in the Battle of Belleau Wood, which is where the Marines get their fame, and Chateau Thierry. So they took part in 6 major conflicts throughout the war. And they did so all within 1 tour of duty, about 6 months, around 191 days. The longest amount of time that any American soldier was on duty in World War I. Constant, they didn't have a break at all from the front lines. Restating what I said at the beginning of the video, they never lost an inch of ground, and they only had 2 men captured by the enemy just to have them recovered. So no member of the 369th out of the 2,000 men were ever made a POW, which is insane. This regiment only failed to take 1 objective in its entire time in France, and that was not even their fault. There was a mistake with the French artillery, making it impossible for them to take the objective. Most importantly, the name Hellfighter did not come from the Americans, did not come from the French, did not come from the British, it didn't come from them. They earned the name Hellfighter from the Germans, similar to how the Marines earned the name Devil Dog from the Germans. But all these accomplishments didn't come without a cost. Like I said again at the beginning of the video, they suffered about 60% casualties, although that's not a completely accurate number. What we do know is they lost between 1,400 and 1,500 men through their 191 days of combat. And this unit only had about 2,000. Now they did get replacements, but I'm not aware of exactly how many. It is still an unbelievable amount of losses, even if you factor in replacements. And now we're coming to the end of the war. November 11th, 1918. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the war was agreed upon to end with Germany's surrender and Germany's retreat from France. 6 days later, the 369th crossed the Rhine River and become the first American unit in Germany. And they kind of work as an occupation unit, keeping the peace for a month or two before they are given the go-ahead to be sent home. February 21st, 1919, the 369th is welcomed back to New York City, and they march up Fifth Avenue in the French formation, 16 abreast, which is something that no American unit had ever done and was really a testament to their service and their connection to the French. Black Death himself, Henry Johnson, is at the front of the parade, and everyone wants to shake his hand. Former President Teddy Roosevelt calls him one of the 5 bravest men of the war, and even Blackjack Pershing comments on his bravery, saying that Johnson deserved credit. Now, military exploits weren't the only thing this unit was famous for, because word of James Reese Europe's band had gotten around the States as well. So James Reese Europe and his band had recording sessions and concerts lined up when he got back. It is before one of these concerts that one of the members of his band, the drummer, Herbert Wright, gets into an argument with James Reese Europe. I don't know what the argument was over, but during it, Herbert has some form of mental breakdown, and he stabs James Reese Europe. James Reese Europe is still alive, and he's still able to talk. He informs them that he is going to the hospital, and he tells Cecil to take the lead and to keep the show going. The show must go on. And James Reese Europe is sent to the hospital. Unfortunately, they did not realize how lethal his injuries were, and James Reese Europe passes away on May 7th of 1919. Unfortunately, things get worse from here. Henry Johnson, while being praised and admired by the people of America for his service, did not receive any notation of his disabilities, nor did he receive the Purple Heart, meaning that he could not apply for a disability allowance from the government. He had to work and fend for himself with the wounds he sustained from the war. Unable to hold down a job due to his injuries and his lack of education, he sadly passed away 10 years later in 1929 at the age of 32. Henry Johnson is posthumously awarded the Purple Heart in 1996, and he is also awarded the Medal of Honor by President Obama in 2015. Going back to 1919, an occurrence would kick off what would be known as Red Summer. 13 African-American World War I veterans would be lynched in the year following. One of which would be Daniel Mack of the 365th. He would be attacked in Texas. He was beaten and arrested by 4 cops. When he appealed to the judge, saying that he fought for democracy and he fought for their rights, the judge simply replied back that this is white man's country and he shouldn't forget it. He is sentenced to 30 days in a chain gang, at the end of which He is taken to the edge of town, beaten, stripped, and left for dead. He survives and leaves Texas and does not return for decades to come. Again, 13 servicemen were lynched in this time period. I cannot find if any of them were members of the 369th. It is appalling that these men who fought so well for their country return home just to suffer. And it gets me thinking, what were the white officers doing? Now, we've talked about 2 white officers up until this point, and there were more. But these 2 were the ones mostly mentioned in the documentaries that I used more as primary sources. One of which is actually interviewed in the documentary playing behind me. You've probably noticed him here or there, Hamilton Fish. But we'll start with Colonel Hayward. Now, Colonel Hayward, through the entire war, has shown off that he is more of a political leader than he is a military leader, at least to me. That's the vibe I get off him. It never really goes into any strategies that he comes up with. It's mostly his political meandering, how he's able to move people and use people to get the best outcomes possible. And he saves their necks multiple times throughout the war, as we covered. So, what was he doing with this political influence after the war? Well, after the war, he's given the position of the U.S. Attorney of the Southern District of New York. And he has that position until 1924 when he goes back to being a lawyer. During this time period, he also participates in multiple big game hunts over in Africa, where a lot of his trophies are actually on display in the Natural History Museum. He brings them back as exhibits. Not only this, but he takes expeditions down into the Arctic and brings back polar bears for the zoos. He is a busy man, but I could not find any reference to him using his political connections or his position to help out minorities or the men he served with. An article from the African American Registry just says that he was a lawyer and he went on big game hunts, and that's it, while having an account of his service in the war. It's just mind-boggling to me how much he did for the unit in the war just to kind of walk away after. Moving on to Hamilton Fish, Major Hamilton Fish, who's a little bit of a different story. Hamilton Fish becomes a member of the House of Representatives. He tries to get 3 bills passed to ban lynching, and unfortunately they fail. And into the 1940s, he decries Germany's treatment of the Jews. He was always a Republican, and moving into the 1930s, he becomes isolationist, and he also becomes extremely anti-communist, going as far as to make committees against communism, which kind of explains what comes next, but it doesn't make it any easier to say. Hamilton Fish is accused of being a Nazi sympathizer. That is Hamilton Fish right over my shoulder. So he is accused of being a Nazi sympathizer to such a degree that it loses him pretty much all the elections after the war. It's crazy. I can only really sum up. I don't really have an explanation that makes sense in my brain. If I had to say, I think it would be that he just hated communism to such a point where he just really hoped that the fascists would win against the communists. And it's still just crazy that he would choose the Nazis. He would back, that horse in that race. But yeah, no, I can really only present the findings. Doesn't make them any easier to digest. With how vast history is, it's inevitable that some stories are going to be forgotten. But it breaks my heart that these men who fought so hard and sacrificed so much are being forgotten or have been forgotten. I think one of the things that's most powerful about this story is the fact that it's World War I itself. This isn't World War II, what we all think of as war. World War II you can justify. We were fighting the Nazis, we were fighting fascism. We were stopping the Holocaust. You can justify World War II. You can't really justify World War I. It was a clash of colonial powers. And in that conflict, you have the story of these men where the real enemy of these men were not the Germans in the trenches in front of them. They were their own countrymen in the trenches beside them. And that is insane. And that story shouldn't be forgotten. That story should be shared. I think President Obama said it best whenever he was awarding the Medal of Honor posthumously to Henry Johnson. He said, "The least we can do is say that we know who you are, we know what you did for us, and we are forever grateful." If it's intrigued you, I've linked my sources in the comments below. I've linked the documentary. It's a complete tragedy that many of these men died not knowing the respect that they were due for not only their efforts, but just as a human being. And it really is all we can do now by just sharing their story and making sure that these men are not swept under the rug like so many in history.
Last time home, haven't time to talk a lot, though I'm feeling mighty gay. Little sweet forget-me-not, I've only time to say, all of no man's land is ours, dear. Now I have come back home to you, honey true. Wedding bells in Junie, June, all will tell by the Junie tune that victory's won, the war is over, the whole wide world is wreathed in clover, and in hand we'll stroll through life, dear. Just think how happy we will be, I mean we three. We'll pick a bungalow among the fragrant boughs, but I'll come back to you with the blooming flowers. All of no man's land is ours. All of no man's land is ours, dear. Now I have come back home to you, honey true. Wedding bells in Junie, June, all will tell by the Junie tune that victory's won, the war is over, the whole wide world is wreathed in clover, and hand in hand we'll stroll through life, dear. Just think how happy we will be, I mean we three. We'll pick a bungalow among the fragrant boughs and spend a honeymoon with the blooming flowers. All of no man's land is ours.